Hello, I'm Miss Joan, and today I'm the Schoolmarm. I'll be taking you back in time to see what rural 19th century education was like. Now, education in our country has always been important, and you can see the quote by President Abraham Lincoln, even though he had very little formal education. Today, again, we're going to be looking back in time, but I think you don't have to look too much farther than the COVID experience. Because when children were being schooled at home virtually, your house, probably a room, became the one-room schoolhouse where children were educated virtually. Well, let's see what New Jersey has to offer in terms of one-room schoolhouses. Upper right, Newark, New Jersey. The schoolhouse was moved to the Newark Museum. Dates in the late 1700s, and indeed schools go there on field trips to experience one-room schoolhouse life. Let's zip way down to Cumberland County, little stone structure in Greenwich, New Jersey. Mount Holly, or Maholly, as some of the natives call it. This is the oldest one-room schoolhouse in New Jersey, 1759. Not far away is Gloucester County, or Woodbury, and you can see that structure. How about Knowlton Township, Columbia, New Jersey, and Warren County? An octagonal school. It eliminated dark corners, and there were 25 of these octagonal schools in New Jersey. Flocktown, Morris County, and notice the structure with the outside and also a cupola. All right, we have the Brick Academy in Basking Ridge. This was more of an advanced school. It's not a one-roomer. It was more like a high school level, but it's still there as a museum. Washington Valley. That's my home base. That is where I've given presentations, Washington Valley and Mars Township. Florham Park, the Little Red Schoolhouse. And then Parsippany has its own little schoolhouse, which is open once in a great while. And my husband had to stand in the Wendy's parking lot to take that picture. America's moving west. Take a look at these schoolhouses. They were more temporary until something more permanent could be made. How about a tent school? Actually had a nice wooden floor. Or what about a tar paper school in Wyoming? Notice the dates are much later. If you were in Texas and Oklahoma, you would have one of these, what they called live oaks. They made a temporary outdoor school of brush and tree branches. The sod school in the prairie states. All right, these particular sod schools were great in winter. They were warm. They were cool in summer. But when it rained, you had a muddy floor. And since it's dirt, you have to deal with the varmints as well. How about a dugout school? All right, one of these schools, a dugout school right in the side of an incline, could be created in one day. Had clapboard front, windows, a one-day school. And here is a picket-style school in Nevada. Rather primitive by comparison to some of the East Coast schools, but they would improve. Oh, now we need to go to school. You saw pictures of kids in front of their schoolhouse, but they have to get there. Well, first of all, who are these kids? Well, they're going to range in age from 6 or 7 to 16. They will be boys and girls. They will be all grades in the one-room schoolhouse. These are farm children or ranch children. So they've already been up early. They've done farm and domestic chores before they even start their trek to school, and it may be several miles. All right. Their parents will pay tuition until the state moves in and it becomes free education. New Jersey was the last of the 37 states in 1871 to go free. I will point out that your class size would vary because in the spring and in the fall, boys were needed to work on the farm. So you got there by horse, on your feet, you rode your bicycle. You can see the kind of a school bus in the lower left, and on a snowy day, you might go by big sled, and then you see the children in the sleds behind. They then had their sleds for recess. Who was there to meet you but your teacher? Of course, there were men and women teachers. This is Miss Addie Carey shown. She was in Washington Valley for 3 years. Now, teacher education varied. Maybe you simply had to complete 8th grade. That's how some people started their teaching experience. But there was a system whereby you were expected to go to summer institutes for teachers to get some training and education. All right, you had to pass tests periodically after a certain number of years of teaching. Of course, there was the normal school, which was geared exclusively to teacher education, or a college that had teacher education. Notice Catherine Beecher. She's promoting women in education. Men, as it says, were preferred in the winter when the boys were there. But Catherine says women were more geared to child raising, so therefore they should be the teachers. And it sort of started like a missionary project. Young women went west to do their teaching experience. Women were also preferred primarily after the Civil War, or during the Civil War. They were paid less. All right, not something that's brand new to us. Miss Carey, when she retired, left teaching in 1901, she was earning $40 a month. Sometimes they were lucky if they got $5 a month or anything. Women teachers, not Miss Carey, she lived a mile away so she could walk. Women teachers and men were boarded out. Imagine this if you're a teacher. You will now, for X amount of time, live with the Jones family. And you may be in the same bed with your students or the same room. One young woman in South Dakota, she did have a room to herself. It was in the attic and had a nice stairway, which got a little slippery in the winter, but she had to tuck her clothes under the mattress to keep them warm, and it wasn't unusual for her to find snow on her blankets when she woke up. There was such a thing as a teacherage, not real common, but it was attached to the schoolhouse. So you had no commute. And again, men were preferred in the winter term. All right, teaching was different, as you can see here by Wisconsin 1900. These are sort of 1 through 9, the rules and regs of what you were expected as a teacher. And a lot of these were geared to women. You were not only the educator, you were the nurse, you were the disciplinarian, you were the guidance counselor, you were the emergency person. All of these things were expected by this one teacher. And notice at the lower end of the list, you couldn't be married. Some people did get married, but very secretly. All right. And you were expected by certain standards. The next one is even a little bit more intense. This is 1915. We've even moved into the 20th century. All right, you couldn't even go to an ice cream shop. You couldn't be seen in a vehicle with someone who was not your brother or your father. You couldn't smoke, you couldn't dye your hair. And I must say, I am defunct on number 10. I do not have 2 petticoats on today. So restrictions, particularly for a woman teacher, rather intense. Now, since Washington Valley is my school, so to speak, I just want to point out a couple things. All right, looking at the picture upper right. All right, number 1 is a flagpole. 55-foot chestnut flagpole was installed after the Civil War. Flag was raised every day. This was not typical of every schoolhouse, though, to have a flagpole. But at Washington Valley, as the flag went up, sometimes it got tangled in the rope. So how did they rectify that? A boy would shimmy up the pole and fix it. Number 2, you can see that strange looking thing in the upper right corner. That is the pump. All right, pumps were different. This was a different version. It was installed in the 1800s, 1880s. Instead of the up and down movement of a pump, this is where you turn this way. Previously, the water had been gotten from a local stream. In fact, you can buy that pump today for $300 or $400. They certainly didn't buy it for that back in the day. All right, looking at the wall at number 3, that was installed to keep the farmers from driving their wagons across school property. And if you look at the modern picture on the left, you can see a little trace of that wall. Number 4, cupola. Initially designed and was on some schoolhouses to let the bad air out. Well, some young girls did some bake sales, raised some money, and a bell was installed. And it's still there today. When I have children, I let them ring the bell. Well, the neighborhood must enjoy that because the kids love to do the bell. Looking at the lower left, an important part of this school property, as any school property would be back in the day, you need the necessaries, the privies. All right, you can see in the old picture the back of the school, and there was a fence that led to the privy to keep the boys separate from the girls. All right, this particular brick necessary was installed in the 1880s, and it is a 2-seater. Now, notice next to the apple is the Farmer's Almanac. That relates to the privy. Why do you need that? Well, I don't want to get into an indelicate discussion of toilet paper, but this served the purpose. And what was the feature? It had a little hole in it so it could be hung. Later, the Sears catalog could also serve that purpose. Okay. Let's look at the interior of the schools, and this became pretty standard. Yes, if you have an octagonal, or you were earlier in colonial times, it would be more of a horseshoe shape, but you can see it's a rectangular building. All right, looking at Wisconsin and Washington Valley, you can see the front of the school. You would enter. There would be a cloakroom where the children put their things. All right, you can see where the desks are arranged, and the population would vary because of the spring and fall boys harvest planting business. Notice on the left and the right-hand side, windows. You need as much natural light as possible. In Washington Valley, these are 9-foot windows, but at the level where the children are not able to look out from their seats. In fact, in some schools, they only put the windows on the left side Why? Left-handers, that's evil. That's to accommodate the right-handed student. Toward the front of the school would be some type of chalkboard. And you can see on the Washington Valley that fence in the back of the school leading to the privies. Well, let's look at the interior of the school. And again, we're in Washington Valley. Looking at the upper left, all right, the front of the school was the blackboard. And we're talking literally boards painted black. One teacher commented, put a little grit in that paint, makes it a little bit easier to write, her take on it. All right, eventually would come slate from the Slate Valley of New York and Vermont. And as you can see, Washington Valley paid a mere $20.44. Those slate boards are still very good. All right, above the board you can see George Washington. He presides over many of these schoolhouses. After the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln would join. Or in the South, Robert E. Lee. Or you can also see the interior flag. That happens to be a 48-star one. And then you can see one of the student seats, benches. So moving down, let's get acquainted with seating. All right, so you can see that black or gray looking student desk. It's a two-seater. It would be oftentimes in the back of the room, at least in Washington Valley, and it would be for the older students. All right, student sits here. The back becomes the desk for the students behind him or her. Now, looking at the little yellow desk, all right, this would be for a single student. All right, in Washington Valley, these would be toward the front of the room for the younger students. And again, the back becomes the desk for the next student. What about that blue bench? That's the recitation bench. The teacher is dealing with students age 6 or 7 to 16. She's got all subjects, all ages, all abilities. She needs those students to come to the front of the room by groups, small groups, where they can then learn a different way, either by writing on the book, on the chalkboard or blackboard, or a recitation or a review, whatever the teacher has in mind that day. So the recitation bench. At the upper right, next to George Washington picture, is the teacher's podium. Not always that fancy. It could simply be a table or a desk. All right, looking next to the podium is the front of the room again. Notice the school clock. We kind of associate that with the old-time school. However, that clock would not be in the front of the room. It would be in the back. Teacher is seeing the time, students not so focused. But notice under the clock, the stove. All right, this would be either a wood-burning or coal-burning stove. And the parents could supply whatever fuel. Here's your little coal scuttle. All right, oftentimes they would supply wood, and they got a little break in the tuition before we went public education. Notice under the clock and the stove, there is a young boy helping to fuel the stove, and that was a job for the older boys. Looking below that is a lamp, an oil lamp that would be suspended from the ceiling. Not all schools are going to have this, but this was something where it could be lowered, it could be refueled, the wicks trimmed, the chimney cleaned, and then raised. All right, this would be used, some of the more tabletop version would be used primarily for evening. All right, again, evening activities. All right, looking at the top You can see that big receptacle. All right, the water has come from that pump or the stream. And notice where the arrow is, there is a ladle. So you want something to drink, you drink from the ladle. Common ladle for all students. Below you can see a ceramic or crock with a cup, and indeed, common cup. You didn't have indoor plumbing, so you relied on a basin and stove. And on the far right, you can see some pictures that in other schoolhouses use, well, for example, the stove, a blackboard, the desks, the teacher's desk. So you can kind of see different ways that the schools were a little bit different and set up. Oh, we need our school supplies. All right, you're going to have to learn how to write. So initially you're going to be learning to write with a quill. And what is a quill? All right, it is the feather from a large bird. Now you can see goose or turkey. These happen to be turkey feathers that I have right here today. But any big bird will do. An owl, an eagle, a duck, a swan. Thomas Jefferson raised geese specifically to get his quills. And they liked the left wing. For some reason, that was the better one to take the quills from. Notice the teacher at the upper left, the schoolmaster. And what is he doing? He's using his pen knife to whittle down to make a point. Now, eventually he's going to have to use ink, of course, to dip, right with a quill. Now the quills lasted until maybe mid-19th century, and then we move into another type of writing instrument. And shown there is the nib. Here's one. I have a whole box of them. Bought this box because it was made, these quills, these nibs were made in Camden, New Jersey. So these are homegrown. All right, they can date these nibs back to ancient Egypt. So here's your nib. So what do you do with it? You install it on your pen. And since these will eventually wear out or flare out, you're going to need more nibs. Here's your empty pen holder, and here's one that's readily installed. Now, getting to the point of writing and using ink, well, you've got to do some practice first. So what do you need? But a slate. Unfortunately, this one got cracked. But this is an old slate. And what you would use with it is a slate pen. Looks like just another piece of strange-looking material. In fact, I had a school group in one day. I know it's probably hard to see, but the little girl put a picture of a little girl on it for me, and I've left it there. That's not what they would be practicing, though. This is where they would do their math, they would do their practice for their penmanship, that type of thing. Paper was very expensive and scarce. This is a more modern slate, so if I have children, they can use this with chalk. Now, once they've started to really get the gist of what they're doing, notice the copybook. This is something they would use to practice their actual writing skills. And they would also eventually come up with a pencil. Now, pencil, we call it sometimes a lead pencil. Well, this is actually graphite. All right, discovered in England in the 16th century. And they found if they took this black stuff that looked like lead, pieces of it, wrapped it in string, they could write with it. All right, it will evolve over a period of time, and they were using this graphite throughout Europe, and of course, it starts to be used here in America. All right, 1812, there was the first manufacturer of some pencils. They were pretty simple. They were not fancy. They were just kind of a rough wood. But then it's a Joseph Dixon around the 1850s who decides to make this particular pencil. He bought out a graphite company in Ticonderoga, New York. So he's got his graphite, and now he's developed a pencil that is hexagonal. That's so it won't roll as readily. And he could churn out with his new machine 132 pencils a minute. They decided eventually yellow, although we'll see pencils of all colors today, because in China, yellow meant royalty and something special. Somebody decided that an eraser would be pretty handy. It didn't take off. Teachers were not too crazy about it. That encourages kids to make mistakes. However, a minister, maybe he thought this was a way to erase sins, he saw it as a valuable thing. So, the evolution of a pencil. All right, what other teaching aids do we have? We have maps. We have globes. All right, we have the pump organ, which would be part of morning exercises. And as you can see in the lower left picture, there are some of those teaching aids. I imagine that big book is some kind of a dictionary. You can see the little clock, you can see the globe, the blackboard in the background. There's the setting. And again, not just the privy, but this is going to be a teaching aid. What are you going to learn from this? Well, you're going to learn grammar, you're going to learn math, and just generally what was available to the farm community that couldn't get to a big store. So here's your Sears and Roebuck Company again. All right, the school day begins. Bell is rung. The children you saw en route, here they come. All right, girls would line up, boys would line up. All right, sometimes there were separate doors for girls and boys. All right, girls would go in first. They would then put their belongings in the cloakroom. This particular picture was taken in an old schoolhouse where my mother actually taught. This was attached to her classroom. All right, and they would come in. The boys would bow to the teacher, and the girls would curtsy. And they would go to their desks and stand until the teacher tells them otherwise. Morning exercises. Now the teacher has greeted them. He or she will take attendance, and then there will be some type of moral or religious instruction. The Bible was very much a part of this, something we don't have in public schools today. And in fact, this particular teacher's manual has a prayer for every weekday. So there would be prayer as well. Oh, but that's not all. 15 minutes of singing. Rally Round the Flag Boys, Home Sweet Home. Songs that were popular at that time, some of them silly, some of them more patriotic. I do have a pump organ recording of some songs. I didn't choose to bring it today, but I had on one school group, I had played America, My Country 'Tis of Thee. The kids didn't know what it was. So things have changed from what they sang and what we even know today. All right. Pledge of Allegiance, something we associate with an opening exercise. This would come out, at least this version, in 1892, as you can see here by Francis Bellamy. Why did he come up with this? It was to celebrate or honor the 400th anniversary of the discovery of America by Columbus. Today we don't have the same thinking about Columbus Day, but he felt this would be appropriate to have a salute to the flag. But notice it is different than what we say today. All right, I pledge allegiance to my flag. Well, realizing there was an immigrant population, well, whose flag is it? Well, it's the flag of the United States of America. All right, to the republic for which it stands, one nation. 1954, under the Eisenhower administration, under God was added because of the Cold War that was going on with the Soviet Union at that time. So the pledge will be introduced in 1892, but it'll probably be another 20 years before it becomes part of the regular school exercises. Classes in session. Here they are. You can see the students. Some of them look like they're posed. Some of them are actually in their work situation. Notice the boy standing, raises his hand and stands. There was a whole protocol for that. Notice at the bottom center, this is a black school. Definite segregation throughout the country at this point. So, class is in session. Now, what's going on? Work begins. All right, the teacher, first of all, is going to make sure supplies are all handed out. Students have their slates, they have their quills or their pens, whatever books that are available. In fact, the students pretty much had to buy their own books initially. She may have, or he may have, written the assignments on the chalkboard or the blackboard. So, teacher has set the stage. So now she will or he will be calling certain students to the front. All right, if you can notice at the lower center, all right, there's some students that are working with the teacher on a lesson, but meanwhile, the other students in the classroom are copying things, maybe in their copybook or on their slate. They are memorizing. It might be the times table or a poem. They are reading, and then they're getting ready to recite if they go up front with the teacher. The older students are also helping the younger students. So you can see this could be a busy time with sound with the teacher and her recitation bench group, or others helping the younger ones in the classroom. All right, let's get into our actual subject matter. Arithmetic. And it's going to be taught after age 9. A lot of memorization. That was the key to education back in the day. You memorized it because you didn't have access to any of the technology or the books that we pretty much have today. All right, you would memorize the times table in particular. All right, you would work with word problems, and you can see a listing of them, and they all have a farm theme. Well, that's their world. They're in a rural community. So you're figuring out something that will be appropriate in your world. All right, you could calculate, do some work on your slate or on the blackboard, or be called up front for, with a teacher to recite. Students were very good at math. That was very important to their world. It still is. And they had to store it and the know-how appear, even though the concepts were not, explained to them as readily. They knew their addition, their subtraction, their multiplication, their division. They could do square roots, they could do percentages. In fact, on occasion, a farmer would step in with a math problem. he didn't have a calculator or a cell phone or anything to do the work himself, he would ask the teacher and the students to figure it out for him. So math, very readily important. Oh boy, writing and penmanship. All right, we've also learned about the quill and the pen, but now you have to be able to write using these methods. All right, the first method, at least during this period, was the Spencerian method. Notice at the upper left how elaborate that is. That is a challenge to write. And you had to learn how to make those squiggles and get your arm and your hand adapted to that kind of movement. Notice it has a certain slant. And the picture of the boy at the bottom, there was a certain way you sat and held your pen. It was difficult. Notice that it will always be cursive, though, that they're learning. They could read print, but they wrote cursive. Why? It was faster. Capital A versus capital A. Hence, cursive. The Palmer method, you will see, will be introduced, and it was a much easier method. And you're, of course, going to be using this in your copybook. One thing I didn't point out, though, notice that thing in the upper right middle, upper middle? That's the metronome. Anybody who knows anything about piano? The metronome sets the time when you're playing an instrument, particularly the piano. Well, the teacher could use a metronome to get you in the rhythm of the Spencerian style. Students have recess. Time to turn out, as it's called. These kids have been up probably since dawn. They've done their farm chores. They've had to travel maybe several miles to get to school. They've been in class doing their work. Now it's time they need to go to the facility and to get some of that energy out. You can see the privy, which is kind of a rundown looking one from another schoolhouse, and different games that the kids would play. Story was a schoolhouse that had, evidently was next to a cow pasture. So it was time to set up a baseball game. So what did the boys use for bases? But cow pies. So you can imagine these cow pies around the bases, and if anybody slid into the base, you can imagine what it was like when those students got back into the classroom. Next. All right, something very important, learning to read. All right, there were a whole series of primers. This was your first type of introduction to how to read and the language. They're going to start with your letters. Of course, an A has different sounds, but at least you learn your alphabet and the sounds that go with it. So your primer was your first reading exercise. And you can see as it goes across the top of the screen, it's a little bit more advanced as you get into pictures and you get into different sounds, and then you start putting sounds and letters together to make words into stories, simple stories. And these stories always had a moral to them. You must be honest, you must be kind, you must be careful, you must be diligent, a good worker. Always a moral attached. You would eventually move on to the different readers. All right, if you got to a fourth or fifth reader, you were good. And as you can see on the screen, you could also be reading some of the classics from well-known authors. Reading was important. All right, next. Oh my, lunch. What we're going to have for lunch. All right, teacher would have the students clear their desks. All right, the girls would then go to the cloakroom where they would get their lunch materials. There was a basin and the soap and a common towel for them to wash their hands. Boys would follow. And then, as you can see, the boy, he would start eating at his desk. And if it was a nice day, they could go outside. So what are we going to have for lunch? Well, we're going to have our napkin. No paper napkins. Oh, we're going to have a sandwich wrapped in some kind of brown paper. Sometimes they put dessert on the top. How about an egg? These are things that you're going to have readily at your farm. Story of a little girl. She was eating a rather slippery, hard-boiled egg, got to laughing, swallowed the whole thing. Teacher came to her rescue. She didn't explain how, but the teacher saved the day. How about a pickle? Oh, from the orchard. Now this is going to seem strange. A potato. So what do you do with a potato? You take it to the stove. This is a little out of proportion here, but you do a baked potato and you hope the little chimney part will not come off. So you could have baked potato. Some children brought a mason jar with a soup or something in it, and the teacher could put a big pot on the stove and they could add their soup concoction to it so they would have a hot meal. So lunch. Now after lunch, there would be some refueling of the stove, maybe a little cleaning up of the room, and then the kids would have some recess outside. So lunch was much desired. Grammar. All right. Emphasis on correct sentence structure. So if you're writing it, you have to write it correctly. All right. You have to know those parts of speech. You know, the adjective, the noun, and some parts of speech we don't even think about today. And you had to memorize the rules. Something they did very structurally to learn those parts of speech was diagramming. So putting all those words now into the diagram. Robert, top blank left. All right, what did Robert do? He milked. That's the verb. That goes in the center, top line. What did he milk? The jersey. All right, I'm sorry, he milked quickly, sorry. And he milked cow, the Jersey cow. So learning the different parts of speech and how they would go in the diagram was part of the routine for grammar. Spelling. Spelling. All right, there was a lot of emphasis on learning to spell long and difficult words. Maybe you didn't know what they meant, but the fact that you could spell it said that you were an educated person. All right, the spelling books, though, were very interestingly set up. If you can see how a little bit in that lower right. All right, if they're introducing in the book a certain set of words, maybe going with a certain vowel sound or whatever, all right, the word would always be divided by syllables, and there would always be the accent mark on the appropriate syllable that you're going to pronounce differently. That's how they pronounced. Now, of course, you always waited for Friday for the spelling bee or the spell down. And it was to see who could be the last man standing, so to speak, who could spell the most difficult words, and everybody else had been ruled out. They had spell downs with other groups, and this oftentimes was an evening thing where the community would come and there would be great competition, the spelling bee. Now that you've learned how to spell and read and say things correctly, grammatically, let's be able to recite it. All right, you had to read and memorize literary works. You were practicing public speaking. Notice the little girl on the left. She is standing there in a proper position and reciting properly. All right, look at the little boy in the center. He has to use appropriate gestures. I don't think it's so good to be noticing his pal in the background that has the dunce cap or whatever, but the fellow on the far right probably is not a good example of reciting properly. He's probably just reading. Little story. There was going to be a big program at the schoolhouse, and the children had their different pieces that they had memorized, and they were going to present. And little Irene had learned this beautiful piece, and she happened to show it to her cousin Lawrence. He looked at it. Yeah, that's nice, but here's something I think you should really do. So he told her to present this instead. And he said, if they like it, say it again. That night comes, little Irene stands up, and she recites. Mary had a little watch. She swallowed it one day. Now she's taking castor oil to pass the time away. People laughed and clapped, so Irene repeated it. Well, the teacher whipped her off the stage as soon as she could. That was not appropriate for that. So she was doing her recitation and elocution, but sort of breaking the rules. Other subjects taught, some more or less. We have the science. There was a Tellurian, which evidently had a model of the planets and Earth. They could study rocks and leaves and animals. Snakes were a big thing. They didn't study them so much in the West. They were busy killing them. But nevertheless, there was some science that was taught. All right, you can see the map. There were limited maps and charts until about mid-19th century. People did have a concept of the shape of the United States and their own state, and they, of course, would have their globe. And there was one little exercise where the globe would be spun, and then you put your finger, and then you had to identify where in the world your finger was. So there was some geography. All right, physiology and hygiene. All right, this got into the effects of alcohol and tobacco. All right, this is all part of some of the prohibition movement, and particularly with the alcohol. Oh boy. Well, things were pretty strict in those days. Things that we would consider pretty barbaric by today's standards. In fact, it would be downright illegal to use these things. Notice upper left, the schoolmaster has what is called a ferrule. It's like a long stick, almost like a big yardstick. He could use that on the students. All right, you can see that the switch was a pretty handy thing to have. You just lop off a piece from a tree and you've got something if you need to apply that to a student's behind. All right. Notice the dunce cap, the fellow in the center. He has done something stupid. And notice that he or somebody has been doing a lot of writing, I will not, whatever that might be. So that might be part of the punishment. And notice at the upper right, the teacher paddling the student. 19 states still allow for paddling, not in an abusive way, but in a structured way. When I student taught in the state of Indiana, my supervising teacher took 3 of my students out in the hall and paddled them. Even one of them was on crutches. So, paddling. All right, notice some of the other methods. The block, here's a little block of some sort in a corner where you had to stand on it as long as the teacher determined. Gender swap. Oftentimes students were segregated, girls on one side, boys on the other. So if a boy did something wrong, he now is on the girl's side and he's wearing a bonnet. Girls could also be switched over to the boys' side. All right, the dunce cap we've met. How about toe and nose? That's the little girl at the lower left. Teacher would have the person come to the blackboard and draw a circle above that student's height. So what she or he would have to do is stand on his or her toes and get the nose within that circle. All right, there were other ways of doing it, by holding a heavy book, a big volume. There was a teacher in the West, one of the western states. It's a little different than any of this. 2 teachers had already been run out by the students. Usually it was the big boys that caused the issue. Well, this particular man was not going to be run out of the school. So what did he do? This is a western state. He came in, he plopped his gun on the desk and said, "Boys, I'm here for business, teaching." He didn't have a bit of trouble with those guys that had run out 2 teachers previously. All right, the report card. All right, notice it's going to be in a percentage basis, and you're going to be graded not only on your attendance and your punctuality, but your neatness and politeness. I looked at this, and maybe it's just me because I did teach. I'm noticing the signature at the bottom. It's supposedly Mrs., but it's 2 different signatures. I don't know, was she having a bad day, or did somebody else decide to use that signature? So there's your report card. Our schoolhouse was used for many things. It wasn't just for education. As you can see here, it could be used for church and Sunday school. Moonlight, this was adult school, adults that wanted to learn more. All right, they would have their pie and their different socials, holiday and patriotic celebrations. Christmas was a big one. Lectures, special speakers, and debates. Elections. All right, they had dances, plays, performances, programs, graduation. That was a big expectation. Teacher had to make sure the students passed the 8th grade test before they could graduate, and concerts. So you can see in the pictures some of the ways that these schools were used. Notice the middle left. It's not on the printed part, but in that particular picture, it is a funeral. Funeral was held at the schoolhouse, and it is women who are the pallbearers. Women pallbearers. Well, as it says here, the sun has almost set on the one-room schoolhouse concept in America, but its legacy still lives on. At one point, there were 190 to 200,000 one-room schoolhouses. Now it's down to about 400 that still exist as buildings. And believe it or not, there are about 200 of them that still function as such. And there is some thinking even today that the idea of the one-room schoolhouse where older students help younger students in a common setting is still important. So, just to, I guess, a little advertisement here. These are other presentations that I give. All of them are historic, take us back in time to look at people, places, and things that were important at one time, and hopefully we can appreciate them today. So, school is dismissed. Thank you very much.